Right, so welcome to the last in our series of Pleasant Sunday Afternoon talks. We've got Carol and David Savage very kindly giving us a talk on Napoleon's Pillage. This talk has been recorded prior to the national lockdown, and we thank them both very much for coming and being recorded today. So, Carol and David Savage.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for watching. Now, we're all familiar with Napoleon, the great general, and Napoleon, the vainglorious emperor. But this afternoon, we focus on Napoleon, the art thief, arguably the greatest art thief in all history. As country after country was overrun by his conquering armies, vast numbers of artworks were plundered, and many religious buildings were secularized and demolished. This was not the collateral damage of warfare, nor was it random looting by undisciplined soldiery. It was systematic and highly organized. It was remorseless and on an industrial scale. So what drove this policy of massive art theft? Art treasures belonged to aristocrats and the church. We know what French revolutionaries thought of the aristocracy. And we know what they thought of the church. But republicanism and anti-clericalism were not the whole story. Classicism too was all the rage. The French adopted imperial Rome as a role model. The Arc de Triomphe is the perfect symbol of this imperial mindset. Paris was extolled as the new Rome, destined to enrich itself with the art treasures of conquered peoples. When plundered artworks arrived in Paris, they were publicly paraded through the streets like in a Roman triumph, with marching soldiers, military bands, and even wagons with caged bears, lions, and camels. It was also, allegedly, the glorious age of enlightenment and reason, and intellectuals, the philosophes, justified art theft with theories that France was the best place for great works of art. A petition sent to the French government in October 1796 claimed, "The French Republic, by its strength and superiority of its enlightenment and its artists, is the only country in the world which can give a safe haven to these masterpieces." Napoleon himself does not appear to have known much about art, nor cared much about it. But, like kings and emperors before him, he was alive to its propaganda value. He used art to project himself as a great and enlightened ruler and connoisseur of culture. Paris was to be rebuilt in the grand classical style as his imperial capital, and its museums were to be aggrandized with the world's most prestigious art treasures.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Even before Napoleon became ruler of France, or even commanded an army, revolutionary France had launched its policy of seizing famous works of art from occupied territories. The first convoys of looted art treasure came from the Austrian Netherlands, essentially modern Belgium, which the French had annexed in September 1794. 3 masterpieces plundered from Belgian churches are especially famous. The Ghent Altarpiece is probably the best known early Netherlandish work of art, and it is certainly the largest. With its double-sided wings, it comprises no fewer than 24 panels of varying sizes. Only the 3 large central panels were taken by the French, and the rest of the altarpiece, with a gap in the middle, was left behind. The exquisite marble Rouge Madonna was not made in the city. It was sculpted in Florence by the young Michelangelo, and it was brought by a pair of Flemish brothers, merchants, engaged in selling English cloth in Italy. They sent it to Rouge, where it was placed in the Church of Notre Dame, one of the earliest marble sculptures to grace the Christian altar. Some 300 years later, the French occupiers forced the people of Bruges to crate up the sculpture and transport it to Paris. Rubens' enormous triptych, it is almost 14 feet high, and with the wings open some 20 feet wide, was painted for the high altar of Antwerp Cathedral. This masterpiece of Baroque religious painting remained in situ until it was seized by the French in 1794.
The greatest treasures, though, were in Italy. For 3 years, the French army had been resisted by a rainbow coalition of Austria, Russia, various Italian city-states, and the Royal Navy. But in April 1796, the young General Napoleon Bonaparte, just 26, and in his very first army command, decisively defeated the Austrians, and he immediately launched an all-out invasion of Italy, leaving a trail of ruin as his enormous army marched eastwards. In a veritable blitzkrieg, the small Italian city-states in his path, Parma, Modena, Milan and Bologna, were rapidly conquered and despoiled. On the 23rd of June, just 10 weeks after the start of Napoleon's Italian offensive, the Pope's representative signed a humiliating armistice at Bologna. A tribute of works of art was demanding for each of the city-states as part of their armistice agreements. Parma and Modena, for example, had each to surrender 20 pictures, as well as millions of pounds in protection money. The largest tribute by far, however, was exacted from the Papal States, which had to hand over 100 pictures, statues or vases from Rome, and 500 ancient manuscripts. And this was only the beginning. France was like a blackmailer whose demands were constantly ratcheted up. Confiscation sometimes had punitive intent, as in Verona following a revolt in April 1797, and in Rome in 1798 following the assassination of a French general. And the letter of law was not always respected. Only 3 pictures were levied from the papal city of Perugia, but the occupiers ended up removing virtually anything they considered worth taking. The artworks were carefully chosen by French commissioners, teams of art specialists who followed in the train of Napoleon's advancing army. The commissioners personally visited all the defeated cities to select works of art.
So, what kinds of artworks were taken? Well, the taste of the time was for classical art, that is to say, the sculpture of ancient Rome and the art of the High Renaissance. Raphael was considered the greatest painter, and his relatively rare pictures were considered the greatest prizes. The first convoy of Italian artworks transported to Paris included 31 pictures from Bologna. The most famous of these was Raphael's Ecstasy of St. Cecilia. Raphael painted the altarpiece in Rome, and it had to be transported to Bologna, where the local painter, Francesco Francia, was entrusted with making good any damage sustained on the journey. There is a famous anecdote that, when the packing case was opened, Francia was so overwhelmed by the beauty of the picture that he dropped dead of the shock. The picture is, alas, less beautiful now, as it was badly damaged by French restorers after it arrived in Paris. But more of this later. Correggio was a contemporary of Raphael who worked in and around Parma in the early 16th century. He is less known now, but at the time he was almost as revered as Raphael. His meltingly soft painterly style, sweetly tender in his religious works, was eulogized as morbidezza, Italian for softness. Correggio's altarpieces from Parma were among the earliest Italian artworks transported to Paris. They included the very famous Madonna of St. Jerome, called Il Giorno. Another painter, greatly esteemed in Napoleonic times, was Pietro Perugino. Perugino was Raphael's master, and Raphael's youthful efforts borrow from Perugino's compositions. In The Vicar of Wakefield, Oliver Goldsmith advised that the secret of connoisseurship consisted of strict adherence to 2 rules. The one being always to observe that the picture would have been better if the painter had taken more pains, and the other, to praise the works of Pietro Perugino. Well, Napoleon himself apparently agreed, as he had a particular predilection for the painter. Perugino's name derives from his association with the city of Perugia in Umbria, and prior to 1796, the city was extraordinarily rich with his paintings.
We might take Perugia as a case study of Napoleon's pillage of works of art. A commissioner called Jacques-Pierre Tinet descended upon the city on the very day on which the armistice was signed. He demanded entry into all churches, monasteries and public buildings to select any objects he thought worth taking. Meanwhile, secretly by night, treasures were hidden away by the local population. Large altarpieces were divided up, and the smaller panels were taken to private houses and hidden under floors and behind panelling. Requeries and monstrances were put in wells, and the iron grille covers were concealed with grease and dirt. Martine, the commissioner, was a very determined man, and in 2 days he had located the chief treasures of the city. To add insult to injury, the Perugians were ordered to pack up the treasures themselves. They were loaded into 6 carriages drawn by 24 great white Umbrian oxen. Contemporary accounts describe the tears and lamentations of the people as the heavily laden carts rode slowly out of the city. The 32 pictures carried off to Paris included no fewer than 12 by Perugino. We shall mention just 2 examples. One of Perugino's largest commissions was a huge polyptych for the high altar of the Benedictine Church of San Pietro. 10 of the panels were transported to France. 5 smaller panels of saints were successfully hidden and remain in the church to this day. A few years later, Perugino painted the altarpiece for a chapel in Perugia Cathedral that preserved the city's most venerated religious relic. The relic was no less than the wedding ring of the Virgin Mary, and Perugino's picture appropriately illustrates her marriage ceremony. According to quaint legend, Mary had many suitors, and the high priest of the cathedral temple held a competition for her hand. All the eligible bachelors were given a rod which they placed on the altar of the temple. The dove of the Holy Spirit perched on Joseph's rod, which burst spontaneously into flower, signifying that he was chosen to be the bridegroom. In the picture, you can see Joseph holding his flowering rod as he places the wedding ring on the Virgin's finger. To the left and in the middle distance, disappointed suitors break their rods that did not bloom.
As well as the organised plunder, there was a good deal of private looting by French officers and men. A famous example is the theft of Raphael's Marriage of the Virgin. The picture had been commissioned in 1504 as an altarpiece for a church in the small Tuscan town of Città di Castello. Raphael was only 21 at the time, and the picture, which closely follows Perugino's composition, is considered his youthful masterpiece. It was taken from the church in 1798 by General Giuseppe Lecchi, an Italian aristocrat serving in Napoleon's army. It was later sold to the Brera Art Gallery in Milan for the astonishingly high sum of 53,000 francs. The French art commissioners were not always honest, and sometimes stole artworks for themselves, rather than for the French museums. The most notorious was a portrait painter called Jean-Baptiste Wicker. He was authorized to take 20 paintings from Modena, but stole another 50 for himself. And he only stopped there because Napoleon himself arrived on the scene. Wicker took so many prints and drawings that, despite having sold most of what he stole, he still had 1,436 artworks to bequeath in his will to his native city of Lille. His ill-gotten collection remains in the city museum to this day.
In Rome, naturally enough, the French commissioners targeted the art of classical antiquity. Some 60 pieces of Roman sculpture were taken from the papal collections at the Vatican and Capitoline. The Pope was even forced to meet the cost of shipping the artworks to Paris, a cost which amounted to 800,000 livres, perhaps £2 million in today's values. The stolen treasures included perhaps the most celebrated of all Roman sculptures, the Belvedere Apollo, known through 1,000 copies in gardens and stately homes. The statue, which depicts Apollo as a life-size nude archer firing an arrow, was discovered near Rome in 1489 and installed in the Belvedere Palace at the Vatican. When it arrived in Paris, it was given pride and praise in the Louvre, shortly afterwards renamed Le Musée Napoleon. The huge marble Laocoon group was equally famous at the time. Laocoon was the Trojan priest who angered Poseidon by attempting to expose the Rouge of the wooden horse. The god sent giant sea serpents to crush the priest and his two sons. The sculpture stood in the palace of the Emperor Titus, where it was praised by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder as superior to all works of painting or sculpture. It was discovered in 1506 in a vineyard in Rome and subsequently displayed in the Belvedere Palace. Art historians cannot agree whether the sculpture is a Greek original or Roman copy. It has even been suggested recently that it is a forgery made by Michelangelo, who was present when the sculpture was discovered and is known to have faked antique sculptures. The engraving shows the sculpture gallery of the Musée Napoleon, with the Laocoon installed in a niche at the end. The first convoy of artworks from Italy also included no fewer than 9 pictures by Raphael, taken from churches in Rome and the Papal States. One of these was the Transfiguration, the artist's last work, which was placed above his bier during his funeral in 1520. The picture was torn from the altar of San Pietro in Montorio in Rome, the church in Rome marking the spot where St. Peter was crucified.
In May 1797, Napoleon deliberately and cold-bloodedly picked a quarrel with Venice. The ancient republic, a sovereign state for more than 1,000 years, was unable to defend itself and surrendered unconditionally. Jacques Piatine, the same commissioner who had behaved so ruthlessly in Perugia, descended on the city. Pictures were removed from church altars. This hauntingly beautiful picture, painted by the elderly Giovanni Bellini for the Church of San Zaccaria, was described by John Ruskin as the greatest picture in the world. Size was no object. This enormous canvas, 33 feet wide and weighing 1.5 tons, was painted by Paolo Veronese for the refectory of the Benedictine monastery of Santi Giovanni Apollo. It was removed from its gilded frame, unnailed from its stretcher, rolled up, transported to Paris, and installed in the Great Hall of the Louvre. When Napoleon decided to use the hall for his wedding in 1810 to Marie-Louise of Austria, the vast painting interfered with his plans, and in a fit of pique, the temperamental emperor ordered it to be destroyed, saying, "Since it cannot be moved, burn it." Fortunately, his order was ignored by the Louvre's director. Paintings were even removed from the ceiling of the Doge's palace, and many monasteries and charitable institutions, called scuole in Venice, were closed and stripped of their cycles of paintings. Not all the pictures were taken to France, however. Many were sent to newly established museums in Italy, the Accademia in Venice and the Brera in Milan. The horses of San Marco are 4 magnificent life-size Roman bronzes. They had been brought to Venice some 600 years earlier by Venetian crusaders, who had plundered them from the Greek capital city of Constantinople, where the Roman Emperor Constantine had placed them on a triumphal arch leading to the Hippodrome. In a sense, history repeated itself. The French removed the horses from the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. They were paraded through the streets of Paris and then re-erected on top of the Arc de Triomphe. Later, when Napoleon had his back to the wall, he ordered the bronze horses to be melted down for munitions. Fortunately, they turned out to be the wrong sort of alloy and couldn't be used.
An obvious question is how well did the fragile artworks, packed into heavily laden bullock carts on a 900-mile passage across the Alps, survive the journey? The greatest damage was sustained by the large altarpieces. These were usually painted on wood, typically a half dozen or so large panels, the size of railway sleepers, joined vertically together. The vibrations as the carts rattled along the rutted roads caused the panels to move and the paint to flake along the joins. But it was not the journey itself that caused most damage. It was what was done to the pictures after they arrived in Paris. It had become accepted practice in France to transfer panel paintings onto canvas. This was done partly to make paintings more portable. wooden panels are extremely heavy, and it was alleged that paintings would be safeguarded from damage from woodworm and warping. Now you might well ask how it was possible to effect such a transfer from panel to canvas. Well, a technique was invented by a French chemist called Robert Picot. His method was to pump nitric oxide vapours, better known as laughing gas, through the back of the panel. This weakened the adhesion of the paint layer, which was peeled off and glued to a piece of canvas. Picot sold his invention to the French king. However, he was soon disgraced when the paintings he had transferred, which included several masterpieces in the French royal collection, quickly started to peel away from their new canvas supports. Picot was replaced by a cabinet maker called Jean-Louis Haquin. Haquin's method was simpler, but more labour-intensive. He planed and chiselled away the panel from the back until only the thin plate layer remained. It was Haquin's woodworking method that was applied to the many Italian altarpieces that arrived in Paris as spoils of war. Now you might imagine even the most careful and skilled carpenter would be unable to chip away at a panel painting without leaving a few holes in the picture surface, and the inevitable paint losses had to be concealed by retouching. Many of the masterpieces taken to Paris have been irreversibly damaged, though their scars are usually concealed by judicious restoration. This slide shows a painting in the Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge, which was transferred from panel to canvas in France in the 18th century. The picture is shown during the course of a recent restoration in its so-called stripped state, that is, after old repaint had been removed and before the exposed paint losses had been covered up by fresh retouching. There were works of art that were seemingly immovable. These were the great wall and ceiling paintings of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael and Correggio. But Napoleon's appetite for art treasures was so insatiable that plans were even mooted for removing Raphael's Vatican frescoes and Leonardo's Last Supper in Milan. These days there are techniques for detaching frescoes from walls, but the idea then was simply to remove the walls themselves and to transport them, bricks and all, to France. An attempt was made to remove Daniele del Volterra's fresco of the Deposition in Trinità dei Monti, the church at the top of the Spanish Steps. At the time, the fresco, based on drawings by Michelangelo, was one of the most famous paintings in Rome. The attempt to remove the wall on which it was painted undermined the structure of the chapel and had to be abandoned when the ceiling started to cave in. After that, very fortunately, no more fresco removals were attempted.
Tuscany was invaded by French troops in 1799, and it became officially part of Napoleon's empire in 1801, when the Grand Duke was deposed. Florence, despite its great heritage as the cradle of the Renaissance, was much less affected by art looting than either Rome or Venice. Its churches and monasteries retained comparatively few works by the sought-after high Renaissance artists. This is because most such works had already been removed by the Grand Dukes of Tuscany for their collections in the Medici residence, the Pitti Palace. Under the French Empire, the Pitti Palace was used as a residence by Napoleon himself, by the puppet Bourbon king he had installed there, and by his younger sister, Elisa Bonaparte. So Napoleon was hardly likely to denude the palace of its magnificent art collections. Nonetheless, some pictures, including works by Raphael and Perugino, were dispatched to Paris, as was the immensely famous Medici Venus. The Medici Venus, a life-size marble nude, is one of the best preserved statues to have survived from antiquity. It was discovered in Rome in the 16th century and acquired by the Medici. In 1677, it was sent to Florence and given pride of place in the Tribuna of the Uffizi Gallery, where it became one of the sights of the Grand Tour. In an effort to keep the statue out of French hands, it was shipped in 1800 to Palermo in Sicily. But Napoleon was not to be denied, and the Sicilians were forced to hand it over. the famous statue eventually arrived in Paris in 1803. It was, as the great novelist says, the worst of times. And as well as the official plundering and private looting of works of art, there was a great deal of distressed selling of artworks by starving priests and monks and by impoverished aristocrats. Dealers and collectors were active in buying up this art at bargain basement prices. The most voracious of these collectors was Joseph Fesh. Joseph Fesh was Napoleon's uncle. In an act of reverse nepotism, Napoleon made him supply contractor to his army in Italy, and Fesh used his position to line his own pockets. He was appointed a cardinal, retired to Rome, and became addicted to art collecting. Most of his gigantic collection, some 16,000 paintings, was sold by his heirs in 1845, and the paintings are now scattered across the world's museums. Raphael's Mont Crucifixion has found its way into our National Gallery. Two Englishmen also took advantage of the Napoleonic upheavals to amass formidable art collections. Edward Solly was a timber merchant based in Berlin. When wood prices skyrocketed, he invested the windfall in works of art. William Young Otley was an aristocratic young painter who had gone to Rome to further his art education. He was extremely rich, as his family owned sugar plantations in the West Indies, and he too built up an enviable collection. After the Napoleonic Wars, Solly sold his enormous collection of some 3,000 works of art to the King of Prussia. It now forms the backbone of Germany's most important picture gallery, the Gemäldegalerie Gallery in Berlin. When Otley returned to England, his collection was sold off to British aristocrats for their stately homes. 16 of his pictures have found their way to our National Gallery.
French troops entered Spain in October 1807, and the Peninsular War waged savagely between France and the combined forces of Britain, Spain and Portugal dragged on for the next 6.5 years. The most shocking plundering of artworks in Spain occurred in Seville, where the churches, convents, confraternities and hospitals were ransacked by a French commander called Marshal Soult. Marshal Soult personally carried off some 180 paintings, many by Murillo, a Seville religious painter, perhaps too sentimental for modern taste, but hardly esteemed at the time. The rapacious Soult retained many of his looted paintings until his death 40 years later, when they were auctioned in Paris. The wonderfully rich royal art collection in Madrid remained largely untouched. This was because the puppet king, Napoleon's older brother, Joseph Bonaparte, lived in the royal palaces and regarded the royal art collection as his own. However, when Joseph fled after his defeat at the Battle of Vittoria, he was not prepared to leave Spain empty-handed. He took with him the longest baggage train in history. Over 100 wagons were filled with loot: gold, jewels, fine wines, silks for Joseph's many mistresses, and even his personal silver chamber pot. When the wagon train got stuck in the mud and was overtaken by the pursuing British Light Brigade, Joseph's own horse-drawn carriage was found to be crammed with 200 paintings rolled up to save space. Most of the recovered loot was shared out among the British soldiers. But the Duke of Wellington managed to salvage the paintings, which he graciously offered to return to their rightful owner, the reinstated French king, Ferdinand VII. King Ferdinand, grateful to have his throne back, refused to accept them and presented them to the Duke as a gift. The Duke of Wellington hung 83 of the paintings in his London mansion, Apsley House at Hyde Park Corner, and there they remain to this day. The paintings include Correggio's Agony in the Garden. This exquisite little panel, that is scarcely a foot square, was painted in the 1520s for Correggio's own physician. It was described by Vasari as the most rare and beautiful of all Correggio's works. There are also several stunningly naturalistic genre paintings by the great 17th century Spanish painter Diego Velázquez. But to return briefly to Joseph Bonaparte. the deposed King of Spain retained a stash of stolen jewels, which he used to finance a fresh start in the New World. After Waterloo, Joseph emigrated to America, where he lived in fine style in a country estate called Breeze Point in New Jersey. He took with him to America one very important painting he had filched from the Spanish royal collection, Titian's Tarquin and Lucrexia. After Joseph's death in 1844, the picture was sent to London for sale at Christie's and eventually found its way to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Titian's violently erotic masterpiece, blazing with colour and sparkling with glittering highlights, was painted for Philip of Spain when the great painter was in his 80s.
We have now reached the final chapter. What happened to all the plundered artworks that had been taken to Paris? The 1813 inventory of the Musée Napoleon included 4,400 pictures, 1,808 ancient statues, and 61 antique vases. After Waterloo, the victorious Allies were extraordinarily lenient. Instead of forcing France to restore the booty at its own cost, they simply demanded that Italian representatives should be allowed to take away their property. A mere 10 days were allowed, as envoys arrived from all over Italy, for the booty to be secured and packed. The British government played a noble part in the restitution, contributing a generous £30,000, perhaps 2.5 million at today's values, towards the cost of the removal. But none of its allies, the Germans, Dutch and Belgians, contributed a brass farthing. The great sculptor Antonio Canova acted as the Pope's representative. He and the other envoys gathered up what they could in the short time available, but many pictures were left behind. Many works had been sent to new regional museums and could not be recovered before the deadline expired. For example, the main panel and lunette from Perugino's San Pietro Apollo remain at Lyon, while the 3 small predella panels are at Rouen and the 2 circular panels of prophets are at Nantes. Perugino's Marriage of the Virgin is at Caen, yet other pictures by Perugino are at Grenoble, Toulouse, Nancy, Bordeaux, Strasbourg, Marseille, Lille and Chantilly. Veronese's wedding feast at Cana was considered impractically large to move, and the Venetian envoys swapped it for a painting by the 17th century French court painter Charles Le Brun. It was scarcely a fair exchange. Le Brun's paintings now languish in the storerooms of the Accademia Gallery at Venice. Veronese's ceiling painting for the Doge's Palace had been installed on the ceiling of the king's bedroom at Versailles, and the Venetian envoys were too deferential, too concerned about upsetting the newly reinstated monarch, to remove it. It is now in the Louvre. A 19th century copy takes its place in the central oval of the Doge's Palace. The Louvre was allowed to keep some works because the French claimed they had been acquired legitimately. It retained, for example, hundreds of antique sculptures obtained from the famous Borghese collection in Rome. This is despite Napoleon having strong-armed Prince Camillo Borghese into selling them and having paid him only half the amount agreed. The crown jewel of the Borghese marbles is the great Borghese vase, nearly 6 feet high and exquisitely carved with reliefs of Dionysian scenes. The Louvre was also allowed to retain many paintings acquired personally by the museum's director on a final 5-month sweep through Italy in the winter of 1811-12. The Louvre's director, citizen Dominique Vivant-Denon, was Napoleon's art advisor and had masterminded much of his art theft policy. Unlike Napoleon, who was fixated on the classical art of antiquity and the high Renaissance, Vivant-Denon appreciated the art of the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the primitives as they were then known. His acquisitions were harvested from the hundreds of monasteries, convents and confraternities that the French had closed down. The booty from Vivant-Denon's Italian tour included the most famous early Florentine paintings currently in the Louvre. It included Cimabue's Maestà and Giotto's signed St. Francis Altarpiece, both from the church of San Francesco at Pisa. It included Fra Angelico's gorgeous Coronation of the Virgin from the painter monk's own friary at San Domenico in Fiesole, and Filippo Lippi's charming Belvedere Altarpiece from the church of San Ambrogio at Florence, both painted in the 1430s and among the very first Renaissance altarpieces, and it included Domenico Ghirlandaio's beautiful Visitation from the church of the Castello at Florence. In total, roughly half the stolen artworks were returned to Italy, half remained in France, and French museums to this day are still awash with Napoleonic plunder.
There is one final sad twist to our story. When Canova, acting on behalf of the Papal States, had gathered together all the artworks he could in the 10 days available, they were sent to Rome. However, the pictures, the altarpieces by Raphael, Perugino and many others, were never returned to the churches in Perugia and the other towns from which they had been stolen. The Pope, Pius VII, decided to retain them in the new Vatican Pinacoteca. The Perugians repeatedly petitioned the Pope for the return of their pictures, but the Pope refused to relent. He ruled that the pictures had been presented to him personally as head of the Papal States, and that he had the right to keep them in Rome. So what were the effects of Napoleon's great pillage? A great many works of art were damaged and some were destroyed. Many antique sculptures were broken up in order to fit them into their shipping crates. Some paintings were damaged in transit. Many more were damaged at the hands of French restorers. Nearly all the altarpieces lost their original frames, and even in the rare instances where the frames survived, altarpieces often lost some of their panels. This is the case with the most famous of all Gothic altarpieces. Our friend Vivant Denon made off with the right-hand predella panel of Gentili da Fabriano's resplendent Adoration of the Magi, and remains in the Louvre to this day. The three main panels of Mancagna's early masterpiece, the San Zeno altarpiece, were returned to Verona after Waterloo, but the three exquisite predella panels remained in France. There is a gap at the top of Giovanni Bellini's Pesaro altarpiece. It contained a deeply moving Pietà which was looted in 1797 and now hangs in the Vatican Gallery. But given the scale of the pillage, some 5,000 artworks were taken from Italy alone, the damage to Europe's art heritage was perhaps not as great as one might have feared. The main effect was to redistribute Europe's art treasures. Artworks were redistributed between countries, but the chief redistribution was from churches, religious houses and aristocratic collections to public museums. And as Europe became more democratic and more secular, this shift towards public museums was to continue throughout the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. It is only more recently that we have appreciated the importance of understanding artworks in their proper setting as the altarpieces of frescoed and decorated Renaissance chapels, rather than as rows of pictures exhibited at eye level on museum walls. And in the immortal words of Bugs Bunny, that's all, folks.
Right. So I'd just like to thank Carol and David for their absolutely fascinating talk. If you enjoyed watching it, there will be a link in the description below where you can donate to support the work of the Marriott's Warehouse Trust. But thank you very much for watching.